Hey guys, it's Micah Young, the host of another Philosophical Tuesday. Thank you for joining us as we head down another rabbit hole. In today's podcast, we explore the value of a philosophical approach to life. We discuss the difference between a meaningful life and a successful life, the process of constructing a worldview, and the potency of art and story in generating collective wisdom, among other things. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday, where we talk about things that you might have thought about and a lot of things that you probably didn't think about and some things that you probably never wanted to hear anybody talking about. I'm here with Josh Smith, the redhead ginger from HE Double Hockey Sticks. Hi, Josh Smith.
Hello, Micah, and I'm Josh, and I'm here today with Josh. Not at all confusing.
Yes, I am Josh. I'm the OG.
You can just, for the sake of simplicity, just refer to each of us as Josh.
Yeah, that will be very simple.
Not confusing.
Not confusing at all. I'm here with our glorious leader, Micah Young, who is sitting on a brand new spanking couch over there, looking beautiful.
I am. This couch makes me go from like a 3 to like a 6, like just like that. I mean, that's how much more beautiful I look right now.
You do come across as being a solid 6, Micah. And I don't say that about everyone.
Well, I'm honored. I'm honored that you think that. So today we're going to be talking about. This is a podcast about philosophy, and while we don't have a we don't have a super constrained topic today. We're just going to be talking about why think philosophically, why some people think more philosophically than others. You know, there's a certain sense, I think, in which everyone thinks philosophically, but some of us like to sit around and have these sorts of conversations, and some of us just act in ways that reflect a specific approach to the world. To our lives and to reality. So, I guess something good to get us started would be, why is it, other than just personality, but why is it that some people like to have these sorts of conversations and some people don't? Go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I don't know where a good place to start is, but I think we were talking beforehand, and we kind of wanted to talk about, we mentioned philosophy, and then we said, well, there's a certain way in which everyone thinks philosophically, and we wanted to kind of narrow in on what exactly that means.
So what does it mean to think philosophically, then? When you think about thinking philosophically, I mean, you can think about having a conversation like this. Is there other ways to think philosophically besides having? I mean, this is a very vague, sort of term we're throwing around.
It depends on how we're using the term philosophy, because, I mean, you could be talking about formal philosophy, which is an academic discipline, or you could be talking about the meaning of the term philosophy, which is love of wisdom, or you could just be talking about worldview or some other sort of generic way in which you look at the world based on your preconceived beliefs. I think probably the best... I think we need to make a differentiation between worldview and philosophy, because we don't want to be using philosophy as this generic term. We want to define a bit what it is and be able to try to pursue it, which you can't do if you don't know what it is.
So should we be discounting, for the purpose of this conversation, should we be discounting the idea of philosophy as in worldview?
I think so, yeah, because it's a bit vague, and it's going to be too much to parse through for a 1 hour.
So we're talking specifically about philosophy as a, say, academic discipline.
No, that was a different. I don't think we need to be using it strictly in terms of academic discipline, but we can be using it in terms of, well, we still haven't formally defined it, but love of wisdom, a yearning for the beyond. I guess in some of the ideas we came up with in thinking about the topic for today, we were contrasting philosophy as being like a yearning for the beyond and a willingness to pursue abstract ideas versus a very practical like approach to life in which you're very focused on what's around you, and you might be very successful at that, but you won't necessarily have thought about existence itself, or why are you here, where are you going, those kind of things.
Might you have thought about those things but not be able to properly articulate them?
Yes, you almost certainly have thought about those things, or at least you have contemplated, or you've actually you've seen some results that those kind of questions might produce, but you might not have given them the due seriousness that they should have. So one thing I was thinking about,
that might actually be an interesting question. It is, if you can't properly articulate a philosophy and yet you are able to live one out, is that less meaningful if you're not able to articulate
and that's
it?
a good question, because it gets right at the heart of what we're discussing. We're kind of asking whether it's more important to think philosophically or to live your life in a successful manner. And if you're living your life in a manner that's defined as successful by society or by some other standard, you can be living philosophically if your interests are geared in the right way, even if you haven't consciously processed why you are doing said things. So I think that's a really good point.
Let's talk about not living a successful life, but living a meaningful life, I think would be a better way of coming at it, because people are going to define success in a different way. I don't think there's anybody who would say they do not desire a meaningful life. And I think if we're pursuing wisdom, philosophy being the pursuit of wisdom, and
I think a lot of people don't
wisdom,
actually pursue a meaningful life.
Well, they might not.
They might desire a meaningful life, but that doesn't mean they'll pursue one.
Right. And for some people, they don't have to consciously. It's very interesting.
Why are we starting with the why do we assume people desire a meaningful life?
I didn't. I said
no, but I'm just. Do I think the reason that's an important question. Do people desire that?
I think the reason we think that is because, well, maybe us three in particular have come to the conclusion that meaning is something essential to being able to get through life, and so that's why we might jump to the conclusion that it's something that everyone wants to pursue.
Well, maybe a better way of putting this, or what might some of the advantages of choosing a life without meaning? What might some of those advantages actually be? Are there advantages to choosing a life without meaning, or to attempting to live a life without meaning? You could be your
true, authentic self.
But that's not a silly plus, to be able to live life exactly how you want it without any consequences. Sure, it's meaningless, but you get to just do whatever you want all the time.
See, but you don't get to do whatever you want all the time. You have to live your life within the context of the world around you, which means that you will have limitations placed on you. So you can't escape limitations by
we're
choosing
talking
to
about
live a life without meaning.
We're talking about the desire. I agree that nobody can live without meaning or without purpose, and people don't live that way. I don't think anybody really believes that they can. But
what's the difference between meaning and purpose?
Well, that may be a much broader philosophical conversation.
No, but I mean that's I might be thinking of meaning more in terms of the word purpose. I
kind of am as well, but to leave that conversation for another day. When I'm getting at,
we're asking what the advantage is of living a life where you don't. What was it? Where you don't pursue meaning?
Yeah, and even with the I think we could all recognize that living a life that is devoid of any sort of people have values, they have things that they are striving to do. Nobody lives their life as if it was meaningless, even if they might not be able to justify why it has meaning. Nobody actually lives their life that way. That doesn't mean what I'm getting at is the idea that that the natural state of human beings is to desire a meaningful life.
Yes.
And I'm getting at that idea of the desire. Might it not rather be that sometimes, in spite of the harsh reality of life that basically suggests that actually your life does have meaning, and there are consequences to the things that you do. I certainly see today quite a push on the more nihilistic side of society to dismantle that as much as they can for the sake of their own kind of self-destructive nihilistic whims. So to me the idea that there is necessarily the desire for a meaningful life, even though I think it's inevitable that you do live a life to some extent that does have meaning, or at least you believe that to some extent. The idea that's a desire, as opposed to the desire being to forego that and to live a meaningless, self-indulgent life.
If you're a nihilist, though, and you believe that sort of objectively from a grand point of view, from the point of view of others, there's no meaning to anything, you're going to still, if you're nihilistic and you're acting on your whims, you're still seeking some sort of, if it's not meaning, it's at least
yes, it's
pleasure. Kind of, it's at least being able to cope. It's at least trying to find a.
To be clear, and I'm making a distinction here between desire and belief. I'm not saying anybody actually believes this. I don't believe in nihilists. I don't think anybody actually believes in the basic presuppositions of nihilism, because I don't think anybody lives their life that way. I think the people can't justify why it is that they shouldn't be nihilists, and so they fantasize themselves to be nihilists. And so I want to be clear that I don't think that I do not, in saying what I'm saying right now, I'm not saying that people in any way actually believe this or act this way. I'm saying that there is the desire in human beings to be able to believe this. That's why people fantasize themselves to be nihilists. That's why we make heroes out of them in our media. You watch things like, BoJack Horseman or Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty is a great example of this. The hero of the story is this great cosmic nihilist who's just a complete asshole. And there's a sense in which we kind of fantasize ourselves to be this. But there's also this realization that nobody actually really is this way. And that if somebody was, they would be the worst human being who ever lived.
And part of the reason no one is that way is because to call yourself a nihilist is to say that you, in some sense, have decided that this position is worth defending. And if you believe that nothing is of value, then by definition you wouldn't believe that position to be worth defending.
So nobody does
it's kind of a mute, it's
but
kind
the
of a
desire
mute point to
is there,
argue.
right? That's all I'm getting at.
Right. So the desire is there, but I think another important point to make is that, and something I'm interested about your thoughts on, is whether what we're seeing in our society is nihilism run rampant, or perhaps more pointedly a deconstruction of existing values, rather than saying nothing is of value. I think what I have noticed is that the argument seems to be that we should attack and destroy values that do exist because they are fundamentally bad and oppressive. And that's not exactly the same thing as saying that nothing is of value, nothing matters.
No. Now, what's interesting is that the people who are espousing those ideas may not recognize that. So they may be deconstructing these kind of historic values with some what they kind of fantasize to be some nihilistic presuppositions that they're using to justify it. But that doesn't mean that there's not a very, very powerful guiding set of principles that they are acting on. It's not that they're replacing the previous values with nothing. It's that they're replacing the previous values with their own values that they have in their own heads. They become they've made new gods for themselves and are doing away with the old.
And I think that's part of the reason why they are so set on.
If they're replacing it with nothing, they wouldn't care as much.
Right, and they aren't nihilists, but I think there is something missing, that they are searching for something that they can't find, and so to kind of make themselves feel better about the way that they feel, it makes it much easier to project it onto the world and say, okay, this is a problem with the world, with society, with the powers that be, and then it becomes much less a me problem, one that I can immediately fix. It's oh, this world is screwed, and there's nothing you can do about it, which is
the fundamental the fundamental presuppositions of nihilism can be used to justify everything and nothing.
Yeah.
You could, so you can, if your own set of values is indefensible, pick your poison, supplant the arguments that you would be using instead of that particular set of values with arguments in favor of nihilism, and you can use that to justify anything and nothing. But
yeah, and I think we definitely see that flowing over into a lot of our culture, whether that be through, the media, I feel like these are talking points that just go around these days, but you've got propaganda everywhere, and you don't know who to believe. You definitely can't trust the media or social media. So there's no trust in anyone.
Hi everyone, it's Josh here. Thanks for listening to the podcast so far. As we continue discussing the value of philosophy and the search for meaning, please consider checking out our other content. We host this weekly podcast every Tuesday, and we are available to listen to on many different platforms, including YouTube, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you are enjoying our content, please subscribe so that you can listen to our future content when it comes out. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
All right, guys, so that was a little break, and now we are back. So hopefully we'll pick up it was a bit of a longer break than usual, so hopefully we'll pick up the conversation sort of where we left it off.
That's my fault.
Yes, Josh, well, we know how terrible you are with computers, so.
I'm actually a CS major.
We know that. And you're also really terrible at solving very basic problems with your computers.
It's really
how
embarrassing.
to get your mic to work.
It's really embarrassing. I'm very embarrassed.
You sound like it.
Aw, you sound embarrassed.
This is going to be such a random making fun of each other in the middle of a conversation for everyone who's listening to this.
That's how it should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's pick up Smithy. Let's get back to it. What were we going to say?
Yeah, so
talk to us.
We were kind of talking, as Josh said, about the difference between desire. What was it? Desire, and what was the other thing?
Desire and belief. So to be clear, I'm defining belief as, say, consistency and conviction in one's worldview. Or value, you might say. So if you
wouldn't you say that's the goal of philosophy as well?
Oh, yes. But and so to differentiate, Yep. If you're saying, you may not be able to justify something. I think there's lots of people who can't justify why it is that their lives ought to have meaning. That doesn't mean that they, at least according to that definition of belief, actually believe that. Nobody, if you hold to that definition of belief, nobody believes that, because nobody lives their life as if it were without meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why I'm defining it that way, because it cuts out it allows us to differentiate between mere fantasy as to what your worldview is and to how it is you're actually living that thing out. So that's the distinction that I'm making.
Right. And another point that I think might help with the conversation a bit is that there are different types of wisdom. If we're using wisdom as simply as if we're using philosophy as simply as the love of wisdom or the pursuit of wisdom, then there can be different types of wisdom. And Plato, for instance, grouped people into 4 different categories. He had the guardians and the artisans and the idealists and the rationals. And so if we're looking at, like, we wouldn't want everybody in the world to be having the kind of conversations that we have, because there are other priorities that other people have that we don't have in life. And I think there's a sort of variety that's necessary for the world to function as it should. And so, like, guardians tend to keep, like, past traditions in order and in place as they should be. Like, artisans tend to build things. Idealists tend to become politicians and change things and inspire people. And rationals tend to systemize the structures that are in place and try to understand them, like we're doing right now. And so I think if we're looking at it like that, then I think we can kind of narrow down what exactly we mean by philosophy.
And to take that, to play off of that, I think that's exactly correct. The kinds of conversations, I like that you said that we wouldn't want everybody to be having these kinds of conversations. You know, this kind of conversation runs the danger of degrading to the realm of the fantasy. So we're discussing things and we're espousing things that we don't actually believe for the sake of the justification, and the challenge of the debate. And there is a real danger in even fooling yourself into thinking that you believe something that you don't actually believe, in the course of a conversation like that, as opposed to somebody who may not be having this kind of conversation, but may hold their beliefs very, very deeply with great conviction, great consistency, and great virtue. And you know, I mean, and that kind of goes back to the main point of the question. If you're living your life, if you are living a life with virtuous values, and you believe those with consistency and with conviction, is there a purpose to a conversation like this?
It's an interesting question, because first of all, it assumes that one can live a life with good virtues and values and live it consistently. Mm-hmm. You know,
and that is a big assumption.
And that's part of the problem is, you know, you can get to that place without talking about it, without articulating it. But
can you?
Well, that's the thing. It's like, and all of this isn't in terms of, you know, scales of relativity, right? You know, obviously none of us are going to achieve this point where we're perfectly consistent in everything we do, and we're perfectly virtuous in the things that we're consistent on, the things we're doing. Mm-hmm. We're not going to reach that point. You know, ideally the goal would be to become as consistent and virtuous as possible. In terms of our actions, to do things that are wise and to do them consistently and with conviction. But it's going to be very hard to get there. There are 2 ways to get there. There's 2 ways for us, I think, to be to either be led in that direction or to push ourselves in that direction. One is by observing what other people do, who are also virtuous and consistent, and emulating that. That could be something that is done either consciously or subconsciously. It's probably more of a subconscious thing than it is a conscious thing. The other is by engaging in open conversation with those around us, such that we are exploring ideas and trying to add to the ideas that we have, add to this, you know, it's sort of sacrificing. It sacrifices consistency for a little bit to improve on the virtues, you know, to grow our virtues and to explore these philosophical ideas, to even entertain things that we might not consider virtuous, mm-hmm. or we might be inconsistent with the way we think, such that we can evaluate them and sort of have a comparison. On the one hand, you pick an authority and you emulate that authority. On the other hand, you pick a series of authorities and you try and evaluate which of these authorities is the best one, and which one am I going to choose to go with. Now that can be a helpful thing, because it means you can see it first of all, it allows you to open your mind and see what's wrong with what you might have been taught. The person who just picks one authority and seeks to emulate them, they're going to get everything good from that authority, and they're going to get everything bad from that authority. Now they might pick a couple of authorities, and they might emulate, a child might emulate both their parents and might get some of the good characteristics from both parents and some of the bad characteristics from both parents. But when you're evaluating the authorities, you have that advantage of being able to sort of look at what might be wrong with these ideas and sort of try and root that out. The disadvantage you have is at some point you have to hunker down and actually practically commit to something. It might be a combination of what you've been talking about, but you have to commit to something eventually.
So two thoughts. Well, one thought and one question. The thought is to, if I understand what you're saying correctly, that at least part of what you've just said is that the primary virtue in a conversation like this comes in enabling one to determine what the actual virtues are, what the actual values are that we ought to be striving for with consistency and conviction. Is that a correct summation?
I would say so, because otherwise, why are we talking about this? Are we just putting ourselves up on a pedestal and say, "Look at my virtues"? I mean, that's not really a discussion. That's more of a proclamation. We're having a discussion. We're evaluating ideas.
Right.
That's the point to this.
So then, my question is: you said that at some point we have to pick a value or a virtue to commit to. My question is, do we, and why?
Well, every time we act on the basis of a value or virtue, whether we know that's what we're acting on or not, whether we believe, whether it even reflects what we would say we believe we're acting on, anytime we act, we are choosing.
Well, that's true, but we're talking about committing to one. So what we're talking about is the consistency part of this, consistency and conviction. It's one thing to act. I agree with you. Every action needs to involve a highest value that is guiding that. Without it, you couldn't act. The question is why do we need to pick? First of all, can we? And this might be an even a better, more interesting question. Can we actually just pick one? Are we capable of doing that? And should we? And do we have to? Is that something?
So let me redefine this a little bit. I am not saying that we take a series of worldviews that are presented to us, and we have to choose between one of those worldviews. Again, now we were sort of earlier in the conversation trying to avoid talking about worldview. So rather we'll say sets of virtues, sets of philosophies about how we're going to act.
I think it's going to be unavoidable for this conversation to
and that's okay. That's okay. But we'll acknowledge it at least. I do not mean that we have to choose a specific worldview or a specific set of virtues or a specific
so you're talking
system.
about for every given virtue, we have to make a decision.
We have to make a decision about, and it might not even be. And again, let me start by saying.
So to clarify my question,
sure.
To clarify my question, are you stating that for every given virtue, we must decide how we are going to act, not only in this particular moment, but also for in every similar situation in the future?
I think we must decide how we are going to disposition ourselves to the world around us. And we can decide, we can talk about these things, we could talk about them all day, and they can be these grand ideas in our head.
So we are talking about worldview then, right?
Yes.
Sure.
So what?
Yeah,
so
I
you're
suppose so.
you're saying that we need to at some point pick a worldview.
No, I'm saying at some point we need to construct a worldview. I'm saying that we are constantly constructing a worldview. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here is it's not as if there are all these worldviews thrown at us and we have to pick one.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that way. And that is a very narrow-minded way of thinking. And I do not mean that as an insult to those people, because it is much easier to take a system that is handed to you and say, that's sort of what I was talking about with we're going to pick an authority figure and we're just going to emulate them. That we're picking this worldview that is often on the basis of an authority figure, whether it's one individual authority figure or a set of authority figures. We're picking a worldview and we're trying to emulate that. I think a lot of people take that approach. I think when we're having this sort of a conversation, we're really evaluating things. We're not trying to determine which worldview is best. We're trying to construct a worldview. We're trying to construct a way of approaching the world. We're trying to determine what are the best virtues we can emulate. What are the best, what should we be doing? We see the good in the approach that some people have. We see the bad in the approach that some people have. How do we get the good and avoid the bad?
And these are some pretty fundamental questions to philosophers. You even look at like Enlightenment philosophers like Descartes, and this is kind of the conundrum they were trying to solve, right? Because if you have a bunch of worldviews getting thrown at you and you adopt them, you adopt one, then you at some point have to realize that there are flaws within said worldview that was thrown at you, even if there are a lot of good qualities about it. And at that point, you need to reevaluate your line of reasoning that led you to believe in that thing in the first place, and then you begin this kind of process of questioning every decision made, and eventually that leaves you to question whether you exist yourself, and then you can maybe state you think therefore you are, and all that. So it kind of leaves you.
Yeah, another question might be, why is it that you're the one who's thinking?
Why are we going down this rabbit hole?
But I have a question.
Because
why is it
okay?
We're not going down that rabbit hole.
No.
Why is it desirable to construct a worldview for yourself? Leaving aside,
I was getting at the fact that I agree with Micah and think that is a much better approach to take when trying to contemplate how to live the good life.
But it's a more dangerous approach to take. Or it can be a more dangerous approach. Well, because there's less certainty. And that's the thing, is when you pick a worldview that's presented to you, when you're presented with a worldview, and you cling to it, there's a certainty to that.
Let's be clear with what we mean here. There does not feel to be as much certainty. I think that you can gain a higher level of certainty in the accuracy of your ideas if you construct your own worldview. But if you are relying on a worldview that was handed to you, then you might feel more certain about it. So the certainty you're talking about is kind of the blind belief that you might have in a belief or a system of beliefs that have been given to you. You have this kind of blind belief.
I guess I'm not distinguish between certainty and confidence, right? If I'm constructing my own worldview,
you're using the term certainty in terms of confidence.
No, I'm actually not. I'm using them as different things.
Okay.
If I'm constructing my own worldview and I'm evaluating the legitimacy of this thing, and I'm going to be continuing to do that as I gain new experiences and as I have conversations. As I'm constructing a worldview, I'm gaining confidence in it. I'm gaining confidence that this is actually a good way to go about things. If I am handed...
The worldview or the process?
The worldview or the process? What do you mean, the process?
Well, you said as you're going through it, you're gaining confidence in this is a good way of doing things. In other words, that the process of determining true and good values is a good, legitimate one. So that's confidence in the process. Is confidence in the process of determining true and good virtues and values the same as having confidence in the virtues and values in and of themselves?
it's having confidence that the whole is improving in its overall quality, and it's and that you have there's a sort of confidence that comes from eliminating the negative, from eliminating that which is not desirable, because when you eliminate something that is not desirable, and you kind of put a stamp on it that says this is not desirable, usually it can be a lot easier to do that than it can be to put a stamp on something and say that it is desirable. I'm not sure what I mean by that, but I think as you go about the process of evaluating ideas and constructing a world, you're going to learn just from improved quantity of data what works and what doesn't. And the reason you're going to gain confidence is you don't necessarily gain certainty. I think the more data you gather, the more you realize how uncertain the world actually is, and how this is where my intelligence sort of hits a wall. I don't know. Maybe you have some questions that you can pose to me here, because I think that's the better way of. I don't know quite how to answer your question.
It's the difference between science, the process, and science, the data set. Your ultimate confidence is in science, the process, as a determining factor for determining facts about the physical world. The data set is constantly changing. However, over time, the data set is becoming more and more refined, and there are certain things that we can say with certainty. Okay, we know that this is not the case. We know that. So as time goes on, even though you're not, the mark gets smaller. Even though you're not, you never get there.
Right.
What you do start to do is narrow the mark, narrow the goal. You start instead of everything under the sun being good and legitimate and valid as it would be under nihilism. You're beginning to narrow the mark. You're beginning to have something to aim towards. Where the exact center of that is, you may not know. But as your experience, as your data set widens, your mark narrows.
And I think that might be why the fact that it takes time, the fact that it takes the process for the mark to narrow, you have to start at a point of being very open-minded and being very willing to take any sort of you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to be wrong, and that makes it very difficult to know how to act, because you could be wrong and you have to accept that risk. You don't have this nice, neat framework that you're constantly acting within. Until, I think that's what happens to a lot of people is they as they become adults, they have this framework that's built, and they build the framework. It's imprinted upon them. It comes from multiple sources. It's not as if it's just their parents. It's their community. It's the expectations placed on them, and it is their experiences. But oftentimes for people, when they're not exploring these ideas, what's going to happen is they're going to build this very nice, neat understanding of the worldview that, while it is very easy to act within because it's very predictable, has a sense of certainty and therefore a sense of safety, sometimes something will happen that completely and utterly conflicts with that worldview, and then it just causes their worldview to shatter. And that's when people have what typically call midlife crisis, because they've had this nice, neat worldview that's been built up, and then it falls into pieces. Whereas
that's any of the most traumatic events in your life are those moments. That's when
yes,
that's when you're 25, starting a brand new job, settling down, getting married, and you're diagnosed with an incurable cancer. That's what that is.
And that can happen to anybody. Right. And that can happen to anybody. It doesn't just have to be, people will run into those things that just completely shatter their understanding of reality, regardless of what level they're engaging with reality on. You know, regardless of whether they're really thinking philosophically about their world and trying to, you know, I have no doubt that there are going to be things later in my life that I simply do not know how to handle within the framework that I have established. However, I have established the ability, at least, to analyze different ideas and to at least acknowledge the fact that my framework is not, the framework that I have built is not an exhaustive framework, and it will be contradicted in the future. And that's what we're doing with philosophy, is we're first of all admitting that our framework is insufficient. We're acknowledging the fact that we're always pushing toward the ideal, but we're never going to get there. So our framework is constantly insufficient.
And it's self-contradictory too.
And of course it's self-contradictory.
Because you can believe two different things very strongly and have them be contradictory. It happens very frequently.
Absolutely. But we're at least opening our minds to this possibility that that there's something beyond. This is what you must do to be able to have this conversation. This is what you must do to engage with other people who have a different framework, who have a different worldview.
Yeah, it's you
must be able to step outside of your own worldview at least a little bit and acknowledge that somebody else thinks differently than me, and there may be some value to that because they are either more successful than me or successful too, or they're trying to emulate successful people. We typically don't think that way about people who we don't have any respect for. If there's somebody out there who I have no respect for because they're not doing anything with their life, I can listen to them and I can acknowledge that they might have something valuable because theoretically they still have know something that I don't. But I'm not going to necessarily have this kind of conversation with them because I'm not trying to gain something from them. I might be trying to show them something. Anyway, I've rambled for a little bit.
You gaining something from us? Taking advantage of your friends, Micah?
It's okay. I was quiet for a while, so now you guys can talk a lot.
Well, it's a questioning. It's a recognition that there are things out there that you don't know, and even more, there are things out there that you can't know. Both because you lack the intellectual capacity to understand them, and because you will not have access to information to be able to make determinations about these things. So there's a lot in the universe that we will never be able to understand.
Some wisdom is impossible to access except by direct experience.
True.
It can even be conveyed, but it's not the same. It's not the same when somebody tells you what it's like to be married and when you're actually married. Now I say that as someone who's not married, but I understand that that's the case. And that is that sort of thing that is the first step to realizing that you don't know everything there is to know about the world, and you will never know everything there is to know about the world.
I'm a strong opponent that Josh is the wisest of all of us.
Why? He's the married one. He's the sole married man in the room.
What words of wisdom have you to share with us, Josh Smith?
Yes, indeed.
Aliens don't exist.
No, it's a lie. That's a freaking lie.
Wow. You contradict the poster in Josh's room.
Sorry,
I
Josh.
want to believe. That's really where I stand on aliens. I want to believe. I desperately want to believe.
Someday we'll talk about.
That's for another. That's for another day.
That will be.
Episode.
That'll be like my Christmas gift to you guys. Is I'll let you talk about aliens for a podcast.
Oh, I'm so excited! 5-hour episode. But Micah, you bring up a good point. There's a difference between knowing that a thing is and knowing what that thing is, like what it consists of. And that's a really important distinction because there is an element of that that's going to be gained through practical experience, and another element of that's going to be gained
through like mentoring or learning from other people. So there are things that you can learn that aren't learned simply through like book smarts or logical processing.
Well, it's like, you have that allegory of the men in the cave watching shadows. If something falls outside of your frame of experience, you have no frame of reference from which to conceptualize that. You can only misinterpret it and misunderstand it. There are some things that you have to step outside of the range of your experience in order to understand it all, because they just fall so outside of your frame of reference. Like, and I love Micah's example of marriage, or more than that. Here's something none of us can understand: raising a child.
Yeah.
That's probably even more significant.
So what would we say then is the kind of philosophy worth pursuing?
Well, what are the kinds of philosophy?
Well, we've just kind of laid out what philosophy is to an extent and what its utility is. Are we looking at the kinds of philosophy in terms of like the formal discipline of philosophy, the different categories?
I don't know. I'm just asking you. That's what you. Yes,
you
that's
did,
what you
said.
Kind
you did kind of pose the question, Josh.
Yeah. I'm asking.
Well, I think it was.
Yeah.
The intent behind the question was more to understand what the use in pursuing philosophy would be to the average Joe. Why does this concern me? If I'm living my life and I'm seeing some success.
I think Micah answered that, right? And it was
I
more or less. Yeah, go.
Intentionally exposing yourself to things that lie outside the framework of a worldview which you have built for yourself. It will allow you to become practiced in dealing with those things that will inevitably come to you in life that simply don't fit within your framework of understanding. And you'll be better for it, because when the things that actually come, this is why we have conversations. This is why we philosophize. It's because we must be prepared to handle that which is unexpected and that which we have not experienced before. And we need to be able to handle that without having our entire framework for, if at the very worst our worldview falls apart, we must be able to maintain a process for reevaluating it, because otherwise we're just left immobile. We have to be able to move forward.
Wonderful explanation. Phenomenal. 100% agree. I would, having seen firsthand what happens when you are confronted with an event in your life that falls outside of your ability to properly conceptualize it, it is earth-shattering. Those are the most traumatic events in our life, and they can destroy lives, they can destroy faiths, they can destroy relationships, and I really think that you just hit the nail on the head. That ultimately the reason you're pursuing these things is so that when those things come up, and they will come up, they do not shatter your perception of reality. You are able to understand them and conceptualize them. You are able to deal with them. And then then you're useful. You're not just this useful sack of garbage when something like that happens. You're actually able to deal with it and be a help to others around you.
And there's a secondary effect, which is that not only are you prepared for when you're exposed to the unexpected, but you are also prepared. You are also just generally exposed to more through these sorts of conversations.
Right.
So there's less that will be unexpected to you, or at the very least, even though, again, as we said, sometimes certain kinds of wisdom can only be gained by experience. Telling stories, relating experience that, and listening and understanding and sort of trying to comprehend experiences that other people have, it gets you part of the way towards the wisdom that can be gleaned from the experience. It's not all the way. It might not even be close to half the way, but it's part of the way. It gets you started on the path, and that means it's less unexpected when it happens.
So I guess then we've agreed on the conclusion, as both of you put it really well. Like, we need to think philosophically. Everyone does, even if we recognize that we don't have the mental cognition to be able to understand really tricky ideas. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't get outside our comfort zone to try to know more and understand more about the world, because it helps us to build our house on the rock rather than on the sand. That way, like, the floodwaters don't come in and destroy everything we've ever known. So it's about that proper foundation of ideas that can support everything else that you come to experience and know throughout your life. So I think that's a really good starting point.
Do you think that to think philosophically, would you? I don't want to ask you to necessarily define that so much as we've talked a lot about engaging in philosophical conversation. That's not quite the same thing as thinking philosophically. What's the difference between, I guess, sort of the internal dialogue that comes in philosophizing and trying to work through ideas yourself, and sort of the external dialogue, which may be actual dialogue with other people or reading or listening?
I think you already kind of made a case for the external dialogue, because you can be exposed to things that you weren't aware of. You can have people reason things through in ways you hadn't thought of. But I don't see a fundamental difference between the two. You reason within yourself and you reason without yourself. And both of those stem down to the same basic principle of reason.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. It is an interesting question. I mean, there is another kind of, maybe what you might say, unarticulated philosophy that I think Micah's getting at right now. Yeah. And that's the idea that you could come to these kinds of realizations and this kind of understanding. This process is ongoing in every human being. Everybody's always doing this to some extent. I would consider it unavoidable. And it doesn't mean you're always conscious of it. It doesn't mean it's always articulated. And it is the three of us are so kind of philosophically minded that I know we kind of conceptualize things in this way, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible to have this kind of self-reflective and self-improving nature and attitude without this kind of explicit articulation. Even internally,
even externally. I mean,
yeah,
there can be, I have seen communities and been a part of, somewhat as a bit of an outsider joining in, communities of men where the conversation is not necessarily philosophical. It's not really delving into, it doesn't articulate the questions, but the answers are articulated frequently. They're sort of posed, it's sort of thrown out there as someone sharing a story or a life experience or a comment on something. It's not, the question doesn't have to be explicit. But the answer sometimes it's enough for the answer to be explicit, or for the story, to be to be there.
You raise a really important point, which is our personal stories and even our collective story and just stories in general, but also life experiences and things that change us have a real impact on the way we think and on the way we come to understand the world. That is a type of philosophy. Being a writer, being an artist, you are generating a really potent philosophy if you're doing art right, because you're you're fundamentally making an expression about the way that the world is, or the way that the world is perceived, or the way the world should be. And so when you make statements of conviction, and if that conviction is backed in a certain way, then that is a type of philosophy.
Well, I mean, before philosophy existed as kind of a science, we had myth and stories and narrative, and that was how we articulated these things. It didn't make them any less pungent than what we're talking about. It
possibly
now.
even made them more.
It probably did.
Like more.
They're far more potent, I would argue.
Because if like a bard back in the day, if he was entertaining people, he had his instrument, he was telling a story of like a dragon and off in some foreign land, and you're really excited you're getting into this because it's something that you can almost visualize because it's so real, even though it's completely not real. And if it's done right, it's telling a story about the way that the world is constructed, and that is something much more potent than trying to analyze something down to its core elements
and
without
what's so
invoking any sort of imagery or meaning.
What's so fascinating about those stories is that even though so many of them were just that, stories, were myth, they were in a sense more true than reality. They contained truths in them that superseded any real world story that could have existed. You think of the idea of the knight going off to fight the dragon. You know, how many truths are contained in that story that go beyond what any, historical battle could have contained. In a sense, those mythologies that were so easy to dismiss as kind of silly, archaic people trying to describe why the sun rose and fell. It's such a simplistic understanding. Those stories are far more complex than people give them credit for, and they contain truths that are, in a sense, more real than the kind of physical.
They're more
reality
pure.
That we see.
They're not muddled by the human proclivity to get distracted or to, become self-serving and detract from the truth. The knight going to fight the dragon is purer than the battle of the Roman legion, because at the end of the day, the rulers are squabbling over a teeny tiny piece of land, whereas the knight fighting the dragon is trying to save the princess or his people.
And
it's nobler.
This dichotomy we are presenting is kind of bringing us back to what we already talked about. So, like, there's a huge difference between the physical world in front of us and these stories, which Josh pointed out, are often more real than the physical reality around us. So, like, if I want a piece of pie, the potency that the pie has is kind of in my desire for that. But if there's a really good story about something, then the potency comes from the fact that the story is unraveling something about nature, about why we do things the way we do. So there's that difference between just doing the thing and then coming to a metaphysical understanding of why that thing is done and the ultimate cosmic significance of it, which just kind of sounds like a bunch of words thrown out there, but it's really just I think the ultimate answer is that there are much more profound things than we are even able to understand in the universe.
I feel like that's what we should have called this podcast. Just a bunch of words thrown out there.
Yeah.
Probably would have been a more accurate explanation of what we're doing.
Much more accurate.
Just a bunch of words. No, I think you make a point though, Josh. It's like, if, there are these truths that are in these stories. And there's these truths that are in experiences. And we can talk about them. We can articulate them. However, we cannot do so exhaustively. we're lucky if we do so without it being to the detriment of the truths themselves. I mean, it's possible too. It's possible to add value by articulating them. And there is value added by articulating them if it's done right, but it's never exhaustive. And that maybe tends to be the fallacy of some people who are like us, who are more philosophically minded, is we tend to, we articulate some things and then we act like that's the exhaustive articulation of this thing. We've done it justice. And that makes everything, that's sort of the, overly scientific, materialistic, modernist approach to it is, if it can't be articulated, it's not worth anything. And that's far from the truth. On that note, does anybody have any final thoughts?
Just that we should finish this conversation about stories some other week.
I agree.
I agree. Really getting into that one.
Maybe we can pick that up next week, since we're already talking about it.
I think that's a great idea.
That's going to be a beefy topic.
Yeah. We'll have to all do our listening up on Jordan Peterson before we talk about stories.
I wonder if people can tell that we listen to him.
Yeah, I think if you've listened to Jordan Peterson, you saw a very, very heavy influence of everything he has ever talked about throughout this whole conversation. So it'll be even more evident next week. But
I just want to say, I was a Peterson fan before he was cool. So,
well, nobody cares, Josh.
Yeah, well, you should, because I got you into him.
That's fair. I appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll call it the end of the podcast there. You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.